Right. So the shift I talk about in my book is a shift from having a job to doing work. In a digital economy, the work you do determines your influence, your power, right? It's your production that determines your value. In an industrial economy, it's having a job. You punch in, you punch out, and whether you do any work in between doesn't necessarily matter, right? Especially when your managers don't want to listen to you and they're, doing it from the center out rather than from the edges in. And so if you realize that what you're doing is futile, you can spend your day on Facebook and give your attention, give your value to Facebook while getting paid by your employer, right? So that shift from having a job, that whole construct of preparing kids to have a job and that whole world of compliance, top down, executive CEOs making decisions that impact the rest of us, flipping it to the digital model where it's doing work. And unless you get the work done, you don't have value. That's the shift that's happening. And it's happening more and more across industries. And you're right that there are a lot of industrial style industries, but they're being disrupted one by one by one. And thankfully, except for it's not thankful because people that are in a lot of those jobs who were trained are now out in the street and don't have the skills. And we haven't created a bridge from here to there yet because our education is still preparing people to be compliance driven.
This is the Play Your Position podcast, where we huddle up, call the plays, and inspire you to run your ball into the end zone. Are you ready to score more game-winning touchdowns in your life, business, and career? Then listen up, because it's game time, baby. Now, here's your host, Mary Lou Kaiser.
Hello, Team PYP. Mary Lou Kaiser here. Welcome to another episode of the Play Your Position podcast. Today, I have a very special guest with us who is suited up, ready to take the field. He is going to be enlightening us and educating us about the world of education. Specifically, where are we headed with our school system? How are we going to teach our young people what they need to know to not just survive in a 21st century world, but to thrive and do work they love, do work that matters, do work that contributes. His name is Nadav Zeimer. Nadav, are you ready for kickoff?
Put me in, coach.
I love it. You are in. So team, here are some things I know about Nadav. First of all, he is working at the intersection of technology and education, which in my personal opinion is a great intersection to be at. We need it so badly. He excelled as a software engineer in Silicon Valley prior to becoming an award-winning physics and robotics teacher, turnaround principal, and public speaker. He got really excited about moving away from software to education after founding a nonprofit that is focused on hyper-local radio production, and I'm sure he's going to get into that. He has been integrating podcasting into his curricula and has been a leader on designing different programs for students. He's seeing major breakthroughs, and his passion for what's possible in education is what excites me. He's also discovering the world of cryptocurrency and what that means, and how the blockchain is teaching us how that same technology can be applied to the gold standard of high school credits. He has written a book called Education in the Digital Age, How We Get There. And in it, he offers an evaluation of how digital technology and economics are poised to transform education by examining the concept of academic capital. And I'm going to let him share the rest of the story. So Nadav, officially welcome to the show.
Thank you. What a great introduction.
Well, you provided it to me. And I always appreciate that. And I really appreciate your work. So right out of the gate, Nadav, you are down on life's great playing field and you have been called to lead. Would you please tell us the story about when you first got that call to leadership and why you are doing what you are doing today?
Yeah, thank you. So I was a software engineer and then a small business owner. So I was studying leadership and curious to understand what good leadership was. And I started to discover that it's actually education, that the cutting edge of leadership training is really bleeding into education, that to be a good leader, you have to constantly be agile and learning and adjusting. So that's kind of a very specific definition of leadership. I'm not talking about position, right?
Right.
I'm talking about, so I always like to think about it, that adage, with great power comes great responsibility. I like to flip it over and say, with great responsibility comes great power. And what I mean by that is responsible, like able to respond. If you're able to respond and make a difference, you then kind of earn power, especially in the digital economy. So if you think of open source platforms, but also in any job, if you're the person that responds to situations and makes things happen, that responsibility is leadership, right? Owning and standing in that responsibility is leadership. So I was in these leadership training courses when I was running my for-profit company in San Francisco. And I kept thinking to myself, why don't we teach this in high school? And it kept coming back to me. Why don't we teach this in high school? It was like a broken record. And at one point, I just realized that I had to be the one to do it, And so I went into education looking to teach. I think the ultimate leader is someone who causes other leaders, right? So I was really excited to cause my students to lead and, to cause futures that wouldn't have happened without their action. Not managing something, not continuing something as it's always been going, which is what most educational leaders do. I was talking with my students about what does it look like to declare a future and then fulfill on that future. So that's the exploration that I've been in ever since and loving every minute of it.
I love declaring a future and then figuring out how to make it happen. That is brilliant and really catchy. So good for you on being a teacher who cares, first of all, that you really want to see students succeed. In the pre-chat, we were talking about the traditional school system in the way that it is not designed for a large portion of our young people. They're just not wired for the way it is structured. And you shared a little story. Would you mind sharing that story about some of the students that you've been able to work with and actually see them succeed tremendously?
So as a physics teacher and a robotics coach, we had unprecedented results in the robotics program that I ran. Our group of minority, low-income students in downtown Brooklyn outperformed all the private schools in New York City. We were ranked number one for a few years and top ranked nationally. And we were the only all-minority team to rank nationally like that. And the same thing, I took over a school that was a failing school, was actually scheduled for shutdown. And within 18 months, we were an A school and maintained the top ratings for 7 years after that. So it's been years of seeing that this model of empowering our students as leaders, no matter what their skills are, can really make a difference. And so the one example is I work at a transfer school in New York. So it's a school that we accept students that are coming out of incarceration or were kicked out of other schools. They're students that have disengaged from education. We go out and find them and pull them back in. So some of those students are terrified of being in a school building because they've been hiding a disability or the fact they can't read or write. And so the school building is this very hostile environment where they have to run to the bathroom whenever they're asked to read and, play all these games. And what I found is when I handed students a microphone, you don't need to learn how to read or write to show how smart you are with digital literacy, with a microphone and podcasting. And those students actually shone the brightest and became the center of academic studies in the classroom because for so long they'd been covering up their literacy challenges with being really smart, asking good questions, talking to people, learning by listening, right? So that was an amazing thing that I saw when I used microphones in my classroom. And then we introduced video. And the teachers would always say when they would see the videos that we produced with these kids that they would produce, they would say, I've never seen a side of that kid. And there's something about this generation that when they're being recorded, and there's a lot of brain research I can go into about the kind of metacognitive pieces, but when you know something is watching you, there's an accountability there, right? And that's what I was talking about before, that accountability, knowing that you're going to be held to what you're saying and that this is going to be shared with an audience, brought out a part of students and a motivation in students, and they saw that it was relevant. And something started happening that students drove the results in ways that we hadn't seen before.
Oh my gosh, my heart is so full. I'm curious. I saw a movie sometime in 2020 during lockdown that focused on, I remember it took place in New Mexico, I think, or Arizona. And it was,
I know exactly the movie you're talking about.
Yeah. And as you told the story, I'm thinking, am I talking to that teacher? I mean, exactly. What is the name of that movie, if you would be so kind?
I don't remember. I saw it in the theaters when it first came out with my wife. I know exactly the movie. It's a tremendous movie about students struggling to stay in school at a school that was second chance school. And it reminded me of my work very much.
There was a team that was challenged to enter a contest, and they had to build a robot, and they had to go around and raise money from local businesses. And it was already a struggling community. So I will find the name of that movie and put it in your show notes page for listeners who might be curious, because it's such a great story. And your work parallels that and shows what's possible when you approach learning from a leadership framework versus, okay, now we're going to see how well you can actually do algebra, for example, or memorize the facts about this one war. The project-based, let's play to these students' strengths approach is so much more effective, as you have proven time and again. And as you look around at what is happening with, now we're in a virtual world where most students are going to school online, or they may be in an area where there's a hybrid approach where they're going, like my nephew, who's actually out on Long Island. He is some days at the building and then other days at home. So they have that off on kind of a deal. What do you think is the hardest thing about being in educational leadership right now?
There's a lot, as I can go in a lot of different directions. Let me just say one thing I love about your podcast. Well, the way you describe it is a call to leadership, storytelling, and the power of audio. That's something that you say about this podcast. That's exactly how I feel about leadership and education. So let me tie together. What does leadership or storytelling have to do with math? Well, the student is telling themselves a story in their head of, I'm going to fail this class. There's a narrative, right? They're telling a story, and that story determines their level of engagement. Right? If you think history is boring, that's the story you're telling.
I told that story.
Right. Me too. And so then your response, so that's kind of underlying that storytelling is what then generates your actions in the moment in the classroom. And until teachers can get down, and until each one of us can get down to that level below the doing, to how we're being about something, if a teacher is playful and loving, they can do the same lesson as a teacher who's angry and judgmental, right?
Yes.
And they'll have very different results. And so the first piece for leadership is for me to get down to that level among the staff, for us to start talking about how we're being with students, which is code for what is the story we're telling about that kid's future.
Yeah.
Right? If you as a teacher say that kid's not going to amount to anything, that kid is not going to amount to anything in your class. It's really a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a story you tell. And because teachers are the leaders in our schools. Principals are not the leaders in the school. They're leadership support. To be a leader in education, you have to work with students, right? And you have to lead them to a future that's distinct from their past, which is a remarkable thing. It's a transformation. And so to start uncovering, just like you do in this podcast, the narratives that underlie the actions that come up. And that work is just so profound to do with students, to have a student who realizes that the story of their life has been you're stupid. And it was because when they were 5, they went into the foster care system and lost their parents.
Yeah.
And when they went to school, nobody knew about that. And they just started telling them they're stupid. When students get the origin of that narrative and how that narrative is driving, they get rage and they start taking control of other people's narrative about them. So that's kind of the deeper level of leadership and education. The other side is just the confusion and a more superficial level of being a manager and being a leader. In education in particular, there are very few people that do what we were talking about creating a future that wouldn't have happened without us there. Most administrators are managers. They just want to keep things running the way they've always run. And when you start doing something else in education, it is threatening to people because change is hard. And especially now when we all know that the current standardized industrial model of education is hurting us, when deep down you know that to be so, people that start unpacking that and taking it apart, you can get attacked in education. People mean well, but they see something unfamiliar and they're defensive of the kids. And so it's very hard to be a leader in education in the true sense, not just a manager or, holding a position. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the challenges that I see. And then, we can go into the details of what's happened with COVID that has exposed, just like it has in so many other areas, how the industrial mindset is no longer relevant and how a digital mindset is coming.
Yeah. And boy, are we slow to make that shift in our systems. I think of the big systems like education and healthcare, for example, how the COVID crisis of the last almost 12 months now revealed, it's kind of like the tide went out and all of a sudden we saw all this stuff that has always been there, but we couldn't see it because the water was up and it was easy to go along. Oh, yeah. Well, we know it's there, but we don't have to deal with it. Well, then the tide went out and stayed. And then it started to smell really bad. And people everywhere are asking these big questions about what does education look like moving forward? Can we adopt models like what you're practicing in a school that is not the traditional school, right? It doesn't fit in with, parents remember school. And, certainly my children went through public schools and they did well because they're wired that way. However, my son is artistic and he did not go to the standard. We were in a district where there were magnet schools. And so he was able to get into an arts and communication magnet school, which was the perfect fit for him. And it fostered his creativity and reinforced the way he thinks about things. And he's a great human and is going to contribute to the world. Whereas my daughter, completely traditional, very left-brained, excelled at all, got her homework done, didn't cut, was always respectful. And the school system's built for people like her. But as we move forward, as this year has informed us, I see more of the kind of work you're doing becoming the model. And I don't know how long it's going to take, Nadav. I mean, maybe you have a timeline. In some ways, I feel like we've accelerated and we were forced to say, okay, this is how we're doing it now. And in other ways, I'm also hearing rumblings of, well, we want to get back to how it used to be. And I'm thinking, no, we don't.
That's right.
Who's been a teacher that influenced you in the work that you do today? Did you have a special teacher who saw something in you when maybe others didn't? Or I'm always curious about what influenced you to show up the way you do today.
Yeah, Zach Stein recently, his book, Education: A Time Between Worlds, was a book that I resonated with in recent time. But back in my education, I grew up in the Chicago Waldorf School, Rudolf Steiner School. And that environment really influenced me. And I had one teacher from first grade to eighth grade, Ron Richardson. So certainly Ron's, how he saw me made me who I am. I spent so much time with him. But that environment, if you know anything about the Waldorf, and then I went to the International Baccalaureate program, which is now very popular.
Yes,
but at the time
IB
wasn't
program.
as popular. Yeah, the IB program. But the Waldorf approach in particular, where there are no grades, you don't compete with anybody, you write your own textbooks. There's something there that, and I thought that's just how school was, but that I was only competing with myself.
Right.
And there wasn't anything being pushed down to me. It was being pulled out from me. And so I think I was given a gift. It's a privilege that I knew that was how education could look, right? That putting the locus of control within the student. And we've since, Steiner's been around for hundreds of years or over 100 years, but there's a lot of brain research that has supported that. My favorite study is this 1972 study by David Glass and Jerome Singer, where they put two groups of people in a room and they asked them to do proofreading and solve some puzzles. And then there's a lot of loud, like construction noise right outside the room, like banging and clanging. And one group is given a button that if they press it, the people doing construction in the hallway stop, right? If they need to focus. The other group has no button. The group with the button solved 5 times as many puzzles and made like almost as many fewer proofreading errors because they had the button. They never pushed the button. They never had the noise stop, right? But knowing that it was there, knowing that they were at the locus of control is what helped them focus and reduce stress. And now there's a lot of research showing that in middle and high school, kind of belonging, feeling like you're capable and feeling like you're independent are really what students need to succeed. And that goes to that. Our brains develop needing to know that it's coming from us out, not being pushed from the outside in. Mm-hmm. And that really matches what's happening in the digital world. If you think about companies that have been disrupted by digital education, it's a shift from an industrial push model to a digital pull model.
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing in education.
Yes. And it's such a good distinction.
It's halftime here at the Play Your Position podcast, and we've got ourselves a great game. While you're up grabbing another snack and topping off your favorite beverage, make sure to subscribe to the show so you never miss another play. PYP is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever great podcasts can be found. Now, let's get back to the game.
Many of members of Team PYP experience the push model because that's we're all of a certain age where it's not going to be, your children are growing up in a completely different kind of environment than what you grew up in, even though you were fortunate to have the Waldorf experience, which is a definitely unique experience. We have Waldorf schools here in Portland, Oregon area, and I've known people who've been either parents of children or adults who experience that. And it's definitely a different kind of model than the traditional public school or even the private school system in the way we think of boarding schools, for example. And one thing I do know about humans is we are very slow to let go of things that are familiar. We don't like letting go of what we know. And I heard a story recently on another podcast about some of the dangers of children now all being online for school, and that now that the actual school itself has been taken out of the equation, like the physical building and the structures that go around that, where you're in a safe environment, then you might have an after school program, or you're in an organized system. Now kids are left to their own devices, oftentimes in their rooms with the door closed, and they are accessing the internet, which could be anything. And parents are scrambling to work from home and figure out, managing a home life that is completely different from a year ago. And there are some real dangers to letting young people loose on the internet. There just are, and curiosity and the wrong keystroke, and boy, you're in a dark world. And it got me thinking about how education in a way has to also go to parents, of how do we teach parents how to raise children in a digital world? Because I wasn't raised that way. I can remember, Nadav, I remember the day my kids were so excited because YouTube was out. And it reminded me, I remember the day when MTV aired, the very first day that it aired, where I was, who I was with, what the weather was like. It was absolutely transformational in terms of, like, we were watching bands that we until then could only see live in concert or hear on the radio or play on your record album. And so the work that you're doing around transforming education, in what ways are you also addressing the need to educate parents, or are you?
Yeah, so it's the same way that what's happening, again, in the economy in general. We're shifting from consumption being key to, from us being consumers and training us to be consumers and counting on us being consumers and that type of growth. And that's a zero-sum dynamic of industrial production, to the production model, where the influencers and the people that are doing well in the digital economy are the ones producing content. So that's kind of how I direct parents too. A lot of the risks and the issues with screenification is because we're just trying to do a better version of the industrial model of having students consume from a screen rather than asking them to produce. Why aren't kids in high school? Now, I'm only talking about high school. I'm not talking about elementary or middle school. I know high school. Why aren't kids attending political events instead of studying politics, right? And then studying it, preparing some questions, going there with a microphone, coming back and editing a podcast about attending a political event, right? Why aren't they going out and producing content? Why are we asking them to consume content when we know for the brain and for so many different ways that we mitigate in terms of like this decentralized working from home? If students are producing, there's a lot more accountability. You can see what they're producing. And then the work of research and writing goes into that rather than having them consume and regurgitate and focus on compliance and control of students. When you try to force control of high school students, particularly who need independence, it's damaging. And so that's really where that shift from the push to the pull, from the consumption to the production, is really where I focus. How can we think about having students work on projects, just what you said, project-based work, where you think about where you want them to get at the end, what you want them to produce, and then you support and scaffold them along the way. It's much more fun. It's much more interesting. The students do much more of the work, so you don't have to be there holding their hands once they've done it once or twice.
Yeah, the key is finding people who are willing to embrace the discomfort of not having a centralized formula. We could talk all day about the need to, first of all, pay teachers accordingly for the amount of work that goes into creating what you just described. Not just, here's the paper, here's the test, take it, and then push it through the Scantron to see, here's your score and how you fit in the grand scheme of things.
That's right. You were asking how long I thought it would take.
Yeah.
And I didn't really address that. So I don't know, but I know, I have a vision of how we get there. And a lot of education reform starts in pre-K or kindergarten to give students the skills. But then when they get to middle and high school and they get into the industrial model, that stuff gets squashed, right?
Yeah.
Anything that they might have learned. And so I'm flipping that. I'm saying, let's start with our 11th and 12th graders because they're the most able to produce content. They're the most mature. They have the most skills. And if you can take 11th and 12th grade and have them teach to project-based learning, have the data that comes out of 11th and 12th grade be based on student work products rather than standardized exams, then 9th and 10th grade start working toward helping kids get ready to produce that data that it holds them accountable in 11th and 12th grade. And then the elementary and middle schools have to start helping them get ready for high school. And universities are much more interested in students being able to produce content than take standardized tests, which don't really show you anything about their success in life afterwards. So what I'm saying is let's focus, right? Yeah. But that's all they have. We need educational data. We need to hold our schools accountable. We need to see which schools are successful, which teachers are successful, right? But we're teaching to tests. And that's just corrupt. That was for when we needed factory workers who acted like robots. Now we have robots to act like robots and humans to act like humans. And so we need human beings that can go to that deeper level and get the narrative that they're interacting with, their own narrative, other people's narrative, and do podcasting, make videos. And so if we can just focus on the low-hanging fruit of 11th and 12th grade and shift it to being project-based, which just means that the College Board, instead of saying you can get an AP credit in social studies, or you can upload a series of podcast episodes to get the AP credit, and that these are the criteria for uploading, then the podcast is graded in a similar way to the exams are graded, right? If we shift to a project-based transcript for 11th to 12th grade that transitions into university, the rest of the system then has to align to get you ready for that because that's where everybody's going. And so that's how I say we do it. If we can shift 11th and 12th grade data so that accountability is not teaching to a test, but teaching to projects, everything else starts to fall like dominoes in support of that. And so how long is it going to take to do that? It depends on, the College Board and people being open, but this pandemic has really opened the doors. And in the past, people thought I was nuts talking about this. They saw the results in my school. They said, well, your school is great and how your school does it. Now, for the first time, we're seeing that we can offer the same things I've offered to my students, to students across the city. And in fact, that's the only thing we can offer them because you can't force compliance and control remotely.
Right, you can't. It doesn't work. No, it doesn't. Wow. Oh, this is so exciting. I love imagining a future where things are better, and project-based learning is really in my opinion, the best way because it is coming from the creative ideas of an individual or a team, and it's more real world. You think of
harder to cheat on a podcast where you have to do 3 revisions and, be part of meetings and planning. It's hard to get somebody to sit in and pretend to be you,
Exactly.
It's versus an exam where after 12 years of schooling, you take this one SAT exam, which is, 3 hours on one Saturday of your life. And that summarizes everything about you. It's just such low quality data. We need higher quality data based on how good student work products are. That should be the laser focus.
We do. And we also need companies to also want to receive those kinds of thinkers and not just because I think there are certainly new companies that have cropped up in the last 10, 15 years that do approach this. However, that industrial complex mentality exists in big corporations as well. And people get in there and feel lost. And it just raises some questions about what will work look like moving forward? Because if we change the model at school, which in some ways is reflecting what companies are saying, hey, we need people who can think critically and be creative and innovate, right? But I also know people who are inside companies who say, yeah, that's a lot of great PR, but it's not how it works in here. Once you get in, it's very regimented and you know, you just show up and people are still pulling the metaphorical lever even in 2021.
Right. So the shift I talk about in my book is a shift from having a job to doing work.
Yes.
In a digital economy, the work you do determines your influence, your power, right? It's your production that determines your value. In an industrial economy, it's having a job. You punch in, you punch out, and whether you do any work in between doesn't necessarily matter, right? Especially when your managers don't want to listen to you and they're, doing it from the center out rather than from the edges in. And so if you realize that what you're doing is futile, you can spend your day on Facebook and give your attention, give your value to Facebook while getting paid by your employer, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that shift from having a job, that whole construct of preparing kids to have a job, and that whole world of compliance, top-down, executive CEOs making decisions that impact the rest of us, flipping it to the digital model where it's doing work. And unless you get the work done, you don't have value. That's the shift that's happening. And it's happening more and more across industries. And you're right that there are a lot of industrial style industries, but they're being disrupted one by one by one.
Thankfully.
Thankfully, except for it's not thankful because people that are in a lot of those jobs who were trained are now out in the street and don't have the skills. And we haven't created a bridge from here to there yet because our education is still preparing people to be compliance driven.
Good point. Good point. So what that speaks to, in my opinion, is a ton of opportunity. So team, listening to what Nadav is sharing, okay, I'm a big proponent of encouraging you to find those light bulb moments. If you are passionate about education or passionate about changing the way that we transition our workforce or building some kind of organization or company that serves that niche. I mean, right there is a golden opportunity that more and more companies that exist now who realize if we're going to be around for another 50 or 100 years, we better get on board. They're going to need people to lead them and teach and demonstrate what does it mean to move from a more industrial approach to a digital approach. And I'm not just talking about installing Salesforce, right? Or upgrading your computer system. Right? That it's beyond that. It's a mindset shift about what is our culture? What do we stand for around here? I've seen stuff on LinkedIn, conversations around how do we shape our work week moving forward? The traditional 9 to 5 or 7 to 7 as the case has been for a lot of people. You take the commute out of things, people can get work done in a more efficient way and still meet the KPIs that the company expects, right? So I've seen a 4-day work week where everybody gets Friday, Saturday, and Sunday off. I've seen, I think it was a 3-2-2 or 3-3-2 or something like that. I mean, the people are experimenting and that's exciting too. Will there be one standard? Perhaps, but maybe it doesn't have to be one standard like the SAT, which...
That's right. And I just wrote an article about this on Medium, but the shift is industrial. We liked standardizing things from the top down, right? And there was use in that. I'm not saying the industrial wasn't useful. For many years, the industrial model was very effective. It's just not relevant anymore. In the digital sense, it's normalizing. You don't standardize, you normalize from the crowd up. Participants on TikTok, the videos are similar because they normalize their practice to each other. They watch other videos, which informs what their videos should look like. And that practice comes from the crowd intelligence up, right? And so I don't think the shift is going to happen at the level of what we're doing, how many days a week we work or whether we're remote or not. The shift is much deeper from that jobs loop where you have to have jobs to make money, to buy stuff so that other people can have jobs because you're buying the stuff, right? That jobs loop to the work loop, which is that opioid dopamine cycle where you share your work and you get feedback, right? And so that fundamental shift for people to get, and I think the younger people get it, but there's this transition and it's how do we shift from people who were used to being consumers and where consumption of stuff made jobs and it was kind of a patriotic thing to do to consume to now where consumption is not serving us and what serves us is production. And it's going to be a tough shift, but we don't really have a choice. From 2005 to 2015, 94% of jobs were contract or temporary. So the job where you get a career with benefits and the steady paycheck, that's gone.
Yeah.
We don't have that available anymore. You have to learn how to be a valuable contributor of work product. And it's a brutal shift for people. And if we don't prepare the next generation for it, that brutal reality is going to keep slamming us in the face. By contrast, the cultures and the communities that do prepare their young people to be workers rather than holding jobs will do very well. And the rest of us will consume what they produce.
Right. Yeah, because consumption isn't going to end. I mean, I have to buy groceries and clothes and we buy houses and things. The differentiation that you're bringing up is that cycle of just mass materialism where you consume, you work to buy, right? You work so you can keep buying more stuff. And yes, we're buying stuff, but it is changing. And
yeah, it's changing to sharing things, right?
Right.
Now in the digital
shared
context,
economy.
instead of buying a house, instead of buying a car, I don't know about houses yet, but right, cars we're starting to learn how to share rather than own. And it's not like I have it so you don't. It's like the more I share it, the more value we all get.
Right. Yeah. Well, speaking of value, one of the most valuable times in a football game, Nadav, is when your team scores that game-winning touchdown. So I'm going to put you in the red zone, metaphorically, of course, and there are less than 30 seconds left on the clock. You are down by 4 points. It's third down, and it is now or never. Tell us a story about a time when you ran the ball into the end zone for that game-winning touchdown.
Yeah, so I ended up on the cover of the New York Times above the fold in June of 2018. And I did not expect to, I took over as principal of the school. We turned it around. We were doing great. I moved in. My family moved in next door to the school. And I was convinced that was going to be the rest of my life was going to be at that school in that building and committed to this community. So the New York Post published some total lies about me, and I was pulled out, and the New York Times investigated for 4 months. There was this whole thing that happened around me. So it was a similar thing. It was like, this is the time I either show up or my career is over, right? I'm not going to have a job. Those attacks, and it's your offense, defense. It really is that. But it was amazing. And I think I call it, going Waldorf on people, the creativity and collaboration and love my staff and I had for each other and that community had. There was no chance of them attacking me because we had those bonds, right? Because we were working from that context that it wasn't even a threat. And it actually just expanded the game I was playing from one school to now offering what we offered at that school to the entire city. So we went from being under attack and trying to pull me out of the system to now having an influence that is so much broader. And it just kind of that exponential. But it was a moment in my experience of it of do or die. This is either going to take me out of education. I'm going to go back to the private sector. With engineering, I can make money. There's no problem there. But the community loses out. And we were able to shift the work that we did with video and audio production and say, wait, maybe this is the chance to take it bigger. Maybe we weren't playing big enough. And so those attacking us made us stronger, and we just bulldozed right through those barriers.
What a great story. Congrats on standing your ground and not letting, wow. It took nerves of steel to get through that. Well,
it feels good looking back. At the time, it didn't feel like I had nerves of steel. It felt like I was a wet noodle.
Oh, I'm sure. But again, the outcome is what it is. And that just, I think, goes to show that when we make a choice, right? We decide you are at a crossroads. You could have folded your tent and said, okay, this is a sign. I'm done. But you chose to go
their narrative versus my narrative.
Right.
And so they had their narrative. You're done, buddy. And then I had to say, how is this going to go?
Yeah.
Right.
Such a great lesson. I do like to ask each guest at this point in the show as we wrap things up to share 1 to 3 key offensive strategies straight out of your leadership playbook that they could implement right away so that they begin to see some forward progress in their professional life or their personal life. What could you share with us?
Absolutely. So it's what I was talking about before. If you look at the level of what you have or don't have, or you look at the level of what you do or don't do, you're going to try to bully yourself into doing something different or force outcomes to have something different. It's really getting down to the level of being and asking myself, who am I being about this? And if it's whatever it is, being with the answer and getting to know the narrative, who I'm being is really just a function of the future I'm seeing that I think is really the truth. They are going to end my career. It's over. Then my way of being is terrified or depressed or angry, right? And then it fulfills because out of anger, I would act in really stupid ways. So really, it's mindfulness, really, right? Taking a few minutes to center and breathe and feel the body below the neck and get to know what the body's telling us because it has some wisdom. And then it's what you were saying about the podcast. It's that narrative of realizing the story we're telling, the narrative we're telling, and saying, oh, wait, the future hasn't happened. That narrative isn't necessarily so. And once you realize there's a possibility for things to go a different way, suddenly your way of being opens up and there's something to be created and it gets created in that moment. And so to be a creator, to be an inventor, to be a leader, which I think are all synonyms in some ways, it's really getting down to that belly experience of life and being in it and owning it, rather than resisting and forcing outcomes and, trying to fight with who we are by, some other means.
Boy, if we could get even a fraction of the population to stop fighting with themselves, I think that's where so many of the problems start, is that narrative that is going on inside people's heads about who the world says they are versus who they know they truly are. And It is not easy. It is not easy to stand up and say, you know what, world? Love you, but this is who I am. See ya. I'm going over here and this is what I'm doing. And that's what I hear.
And you start at the individual level.
Yes.
And once you master the individual level, that is what a CEO of a company does. They manage the narrative of the company. And if people believe that the narrative is whatever Elon Musk's narrative or anybody, if they believe what comes out of your mouth, that's going to happen, stock prices go, everything, all the wealth and all the outcomes are generated by the way of being, which is given by that narrative. And we have to start by learning to do it for and with ourselves. But then once you build that muscle for yourself, you can use it at any level, from the organization to the family to anything.
That's right. You absolutely can. So for people who'd like to learn more about you and the work you're doing, where can they connect with you online?
So principlez.org. There's a PDF there, one-page PDF about deeper learning, what kind of the keys to deeper learning. And there's an opportunity to join my mailing list, and I'll share updates with you. The work I'm doing in high school credits is hs.credit is the website. And the password, you need a password to get in right now. It's welcome guest, capital W, capital G. So that's if you're curious. And then my book, as you said, Education Digital Age, How We Get There. And I respond to all emails myself. I love to engage with anybody that's interested in discussing this or going deeper into this. And yeah, I appreciate any opportunity to discuss education with anybody, because we're all stakeholders in education.
We certainly are. I'm just typing out the welcome guest password. And team, you know that the links to connect with Nadav will be on his show notes page at pyppodcast.com. You can also listen to the episode there and learn more about what he's doing, because the future of education is already changing. And you heard it. He declared it, and it will be true.
That's right.
And I'm a big fan and a big supporter of anything that we can do to make learning more interesting, more relevant, and also better for the planet. I mean, it's all connected.
Yep.
It's just all connected. And to think otherwise is just downright foolish. And you have been an absolute delight today, Nadav. I've enjoyed listening to your triumphs and also the challenges you faced. I'm extremely passionate about what you do in the world, because it's good work.
That's what you do, right? I think a podcaster is an educator in the same way that I am. We're doing the same work.
We are, and we've both decided to show up, and that's half the battle right there. Before we say goodbye, I know you said you played football in high school. Do you have a team that you like to watch on Sunday, or are you not a TV person or sports fan?
I actually don't have a TV, but I watch sports when it gets to the final rounds because it's fun, and the Chicago Bears are going to always be my team.
Those are your roots, is Chicago. I think of you being in New York and also San Francisco, right? You've been all over the place.
Right, that's right.
Well, as of this recording, I think the Bears are in the playoffs, and we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Right.
By the time this airs, the Super Bowl will have come and gone, and there'll be an asterisk next to the winner because it was definitely a different year.
Yeah.
But we're looking ahead to brighter future with less restrictions and more great conversations around what it means to learn and lead. And for that, I'm really grateful for your time today, Nadav. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Hey team, Mary Lou here. Who's number one in football changes from year to year. Fashion trends come and go, same with musical tastes. But leadership skills, they never go out of style. In fact, these days, leadership is an essential survival skill for a world that demands more from us than ever before. To succeed these days, you need to know how to show up for yourself so that you can then do the work you love with people you like the way you want. The Play Your Position Leadership Playbook helps you do this, and it's free. Go to pyppodcast.com to download your copy today. If being more successful this year, next year, in the 21st century is on your to-do list, get your copy of the Play Your Position Leadership Playbook now. pyppodcast.com. It's at the top of the page. You can't miss it. That's pyppodcast.com, and start being more of the leader you are meant to be today. This podcast was produced by Daniel Romeros. Show notes for this episode can be found over at pyppodcast.com. I'm Mary Lou Kaiser. Thanks for listening.
Got a great key offensive strategy you like to share? Write to us at coach@pyppodcast.com or on Twitter, use hashtag PYP and let us know how you're running your ball into the end zone for those game-winning touchdowns.